So here we have the exact same code from the last video, and the very first thing I want to do is I want to figure out how can I take this really long complex inline type, extract it out into its own type, which I can actually use all over the place. For example, if I had a person2 down here, I want to set them equal to some value, I don't want to have to copy and paste this type down and then make sure I update all of these in the same place. I just want to use one type where everything is defined. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can come up to the very top of our file. Generally, at the top of the file is where I like to define my types, or at the very least, I like to define them right before they're going to be used. And what you can do is you can define a type. And to do that, you just type in the word type, just like that. It's just like you would define a constant variable. We're instead defining a type. And this is something that only works in TypeScript because JavaScript has no type property. So if you type in the word type, then we can type in the name of our type. The important thing here to note is that almost always when you're using TypeScript, your types are going to be in camel case where the first letter is capitalized. So this would be a person type. If, for example, my type was called person name, it would look like this, where it's camel cased with all capital letters. So the very first one's capitalized, the second word's capitalized, and so on. This is kind of the opposite of JavaScript, where you leave the first lowercase. So this is how I would write this in JavaScript. But if I'm creating a type in TypeScript, you almost always are going to be using capital letters for the very first letter of each word. Then if you're using a type like this, all I say is I want my type to equal some value, just like you would do in JavaScript. And here is where you put everything that would come after your colon. So I'm just going to copy all of this. I'm going to paste it down right here. And then instead of the actual full type here, I can just write out what the name of my type variable is. I've created this type variable person, and I can define this person as that. Same thing here. I can define this as a person as well. This is going to give me some errors because I don't have a name or anything defined for this person. So let's give them a name of Sally and an age of 23. There we go. Now if I give that a quick save, you can see we have no errors anywhere. When I hover over my person, you can see it explains that this is what my type looks like, which is the exact same type I had before. And my person is now set to this person type. And this is really cool because now I have the ability to extract this type out. So for example, if I wanted to add something to this, for example, I wanted to add some friends, and the friends is just going to be an array of strings. So we'll say it's going to be a string array just like that. You can now see that I have an error on both of these because both of them are missing that friends property. I could just come in here, say that friends is going to be equal to an empty array, and same thing here, friends is equal to an empty array, and now that's going to work just fine. Another really cool thing about using types is I can actually use nested objects inside of here. You can do that inline as well, but it becomes a huge mess to deal with. So for example, I could have an address property, and in this address, I could have a street, which is going to be a string. And now what I can do is I can add in an address, and I can add in a street, which will just say like Main Street. There we go. And we can just comment the second person out so we don't have to worry about those errors. So this is something really important to understand because almost every time that you're creating an object type, for example, this person object type, you're going to want to do it as an actual type variable instead of doing it inline just because it makes your code a lot easier to read. Because this is not too hard to understand, but if I were to copy this down and replace this person here like this is much more difficult to understand what is going on, and I can't reuse it anywhere else, which is why, again, almost always if you're going to be doing a long, complex object type like this, it makes sense to extract it into a type. Now, the really great thing about a type in TypeScript is that you can use it with literally anything. Like I said, all you do is you take whatever is after the colon and you put that right after the equal sign. So for example, I could say that this is going to be a number. And now, if I were to actually set this to a number by just saying 3 here, for example, you can see that my person type is set to a number. So my person here is just a number, and that's going to work fine. If I change it to a string, obviously it's going to fail. So types work by just replacing whatever is after the colon with the actual type name, and then taking what used to be after that colon and putting it after the equal sign for the type. It's relatively straightforward to create. Now let's go back to when we had an actual person object, and we're going to talk about interfaces next, because interfaces are nearly identical to types, but there are a few minor differences you need to understand. So to change something to an interface, instead of using type, we're just going to say interface here. So we'll say interface like that, and we actually remove the equal sign. And the reason we do that is because interfaces can only be used with objects. It must be used with something that is some type of object type. So in our case, we have this object which has a name, an age, and so on. So that's how an interface works. But the one downside to this is there's no way for me to set this interface to a number because it only works with objects. Like I can't just say number here and I can't say equal number. None of those are going to work. It must be used with an object type. The only difference when you create them is that you use the word interface instead of type, and you don't have an equal sign anymore because you're not actually setting it to something, you're just defining this interface inline like this. Now, other than that, when you actually use the two, they work exactly the same. So it doesn't matter if something's an interface or a type. When you actually set it to a variable like this person is set to this person type, it doesn't matter because it's going to work exactly the same. So you don't have to worry about the differences between the two when you're using them. But when you define them, there are some minor differences like you see here that you need to know about. And there's some other minor differences we're going to talk about later in this course, which aren't super important right now. Now, when it comes to which one to choose, again, it's entirely personal preference, but I generally lean more towards using a type instead of an interface for two reasons. One, I just like the keyword of type better, and I like the way that you can extend types and so on, which we'll cover later in this course, a little bit better than interfaces. But secondly, and probably most importantly, is a type is much more flexible because I don't have to just use objects. I can set it to something like a number instead, and that's again going to work just fine. That's one reason that I like to use types instead of interfaces, but you can use whatever you prefer because again, they're both interchangeable and you can use them in all of the same places, except for the case where you want to set an interface to a specific value like a number or a string. That doesn't work.